Welcome to Hot Seat on Sri Lanka Live. With me is Sri Lanka's former permanent representative and ambassador to the UN in Geneva, as well as Sri Lanka's former ambassador in France and to the UNESCO. None other than Dr. Dayan Jayatilleke. Welcome, Doctor.
Hi, Dushan.
First, we'd like to know, all your positions seems to be former positions. So what's your role now?
Well, it's what you see. I'm an analyst and a commentator in the media, but that apart, I also write books. My last book came out this year in London. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan. So I do that as well, my serious intellectual work and publishing. But domestically, I function as what used to be called a talking head on television, radio, in the print media. I write my columns to the print media as well. I am a frequent public speaker. I suppose you could classify it as the Americans do as a public intellectual.
Right. Okay. Doctor, we saw a lot of, victorious achievements during your time, especially when you were the permanent representative of the UN in Geneva, an ambassador. Have you been sidelined by the Ministry of External Affairs?
Well, yes. That's a short answer to the question, yes. Okay.
So what do you think about the appointment of all these non-career diplomats?
Well, it depends. Now, I was not a career diplomat. Tamara Kunanagam was not a career diplomat. Our most distinguished diplomats in the history of Sri Lankan diplomacy, Hamilton Shelly Amarasinghe and Neville Kanagaratne, were non-career diplomats. The problem is not having non-career diplomats. The problem is whether those non-career diplomats have the requisite ability and credentials. Now, I'm afraid there have been many non-career diplomats appointed, especially in the post-war period, who have not had the education and the credentials to serve. Some of them have been appointed to very important capitals, such as Washington, D.C. I don't mean Prasad Karivasam, but his predecessor for many years was the person without even a first degree from a university. So that's shocking, it's shameful.
Dr. Jayatilleke, what do you think about the measures taken by the Ministry of External Affairs, whether they are proactive or reactive in terms of avoiding the re-emergence of LTTE overseas?
Well, the LTTE overseas has proved to be a more effective diplomatic machine than the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry. Right. To the extent that, as the Foreign Ministry says, the pro-LTTE diaspora or the LTTE diaspora is behind some of these moves on human rights and some of these resolutions and so on. If you believe that story, then you also have to accept the fact that the Tigers have beaten the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry, because we have lost 3 times in Geneva and we are on the retreat in Britain. Even though we head the Commonwealth, we are unable to go to Britain, really, even for official Commonwealth occasions. So there has been a general retreat, and if it is the Tigers who are behind these moves, then they've done better than the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry. I really think that the truth is that while we defeated Velupilla Prabhakaran's army, the Sri Lankan government forgot that there was another army. And that army was raised and trained by Anton Balasinghe. That's the international network of educated, motivated, young members of the Tamil diaspora.
The intellectuals.
Intellectuals, professionals, yeah. People in the arts, such as MIA, the rapper. These are Balasinghe's boys and girls, who are now men and women. Yeah. And that army not only has not been defeated by the Sri Lankan side, they have been doing better than the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry in the last few years, in the post-war years. Now, of course, we faced them in Geneva in 2009. There were 20,000 demonstrators with tiger flags and guys in suits lobbying in the corridors of the UN in Geneva, but we beat them, getting almost a 2/3 majority in May 2009. But, that was on my watch. After that, it's been, the record shows that it's been downhill all the way.
But doctor, now Sri Lanka, we just don't have one minister or a deputy minister or a permanent secretary. We have a monitoring MP as well to look after the Minister of External Affairs. But still, the LTT, the international, their network is more powerful than Sri Lankan measures.
Well, naturally, I mean, when you have a monitoring MP who is also the presidential advisor on international affairs, who doesn't have a basic degree from university, how do you expect us to do well in international affairs? I mean, it's simply not possible. I worked with a previous presidential advisor on international affairs, and that was Mr. Bradman Weerakon, who was not only a distinguished civil servant, he was also, I believe, the first Fulbright scholarship winner in Sri Lanka. I was another one. But that was the level of the presidential advisors on international affairs that we had. When you have somebody who doesn't have the formal education or the experience in international relations and diplomacy in those important posts and giving orders, I mean, naturally, everything will collapse.
What do you think about current Sri Lanka's foreign relations? Are we too dependent on China?
No, we are not too dependent on China. China and Russia have consistently supported us. And I think the fact that you have a world power with the world's second largest economy, which does not have a Tamil diaspora in it, is a great thing. And the fact that it supports us is wonderful. I think the problem is that those who manage Sri Lanka's foreign relations think that we have the support of China, therefore we are safe. We are in the safe zone. We don't have to cultivate good relations even with our neighbor, India. Now that's wrong. I think it's very simple to do. We can go back to the Lakshman Kadaragama era of balancing India, China, and the United States. But that has not been done.
Our relations with, especially wanted to touch on that part as well, with China and Russia, have it been detrimental to our relations with our neighbors like India, and at the same time our relations with the Western countries?
Well, not necessarily. In 2009, when we won in Geneva, we had the support, the active support of India and Pakistan, of India, China, and Russia. So we had India and China with us. It can be done. You can have both with you. And we proved that when I was serving there. What has happened since is that relations with India have been allowed to decline. At best, they are uneven. But this is our most important single relationship. This is our neighbor, a giant neighbor, which won't go away. We don't have any other neighbors. So that relationship has to be carefully managed. It is not being carefully managed. What was necessary was to address India's most important concern in the post-war period, which was the setting up of a viable Northern Provincial Council and mainstreaming it, allowing it to function properly within the Sri Lankan constitution. We delayed in doing that. I had advocated that in 2009, and I think that's one of the reasons I was fired. But eventually, the elections were held and the Provincial Council set up. But there again, we didn't manage the relationship well. If we had worked with India, then we could have caged in that Provincial Council much more than we have now. Instead, you have a very turbulent Northern Provincial Council. So I think the relationship with India was not managed properly. We should have moved on the 13th Amendment. We should have moved on addressing India's apprehensions about Chinese submarines and so on. We can't and we should not stop the Chinese passing through. They've been our friends. But if we had a good relationship with India, the Indians may not have looked at it quite so suspiciously. And then economic relations, the signing of SEPA and so on. I'm not saying we should have done all those things, but we should have done one or two of those things. But we didn't do anything.
Doctor, the other part is that government is now talking about an international coup here at this presidential election, especially to topple the present government and to bring in a new power. What do you think? How do you want to respond to this?
Well, yes and no. Or should I say no and yes? I mean, the government is partly responsible for being in this situation of vulnerability. As I have explained, we didn't conduct our foreign relations in the correct manner, though we had a model in Geneva in 2009 of success. But the government did not build on it, it didn't consolidate, it didn't replicate that that model of success. Okay, so that part of it is the fault of the government. But as a student of international relations, I must say that I fully believe that there is a Western move against Sri Lanka. I mean, there was a resolution on allegations of war crimes, a draft resolution floating around in Geneva. The West was floating it. In 2006, before I got there in 2007. And the war had hardly started. How can you have war crimes resolution, a draft, in 2006? So these guys were out to get us. There's no question. And this UN the inquiry into war crimes is criminal, is unprecedented. No country, no democratic country has been subject to this kind of treatment of a war fought against a terrorist army, an army of suicide bombers, a war fought not by a military junta, not by a military regime, but by an elected democratic regime, using its legitimate armed forces and prevailing over the terrorist enemy. Such a war being investigated by the United Nations for the commission of war crimes a mere 5 years after the war has ended. Now, that tells me that there is a definite move against Sri Lanka. There is a move to punish us for having taken that war to a victorious conclusion. One of the reasons is that there's a very active Tamil diaspora lobby in the West. The other reason is that President Mahinda Rajapaksa is far too independent for the Western powers. And they don't like strong leaders. And this is true from Venezuela across the spectrum to the Ukraine, to Belarus, to Russia, even China, if you take the recent incidents in Hong Kong. There is a move in many parts of the world to oust, to destabilize strong, independent-minded leaders. And the third factor is that the United States is competing with China in Asia, and it sees Sri Lanka as tilting towards China and Russia. Trincomalee is of great strategic significance, and the West would like a puppet administration in Sri Lanka. And I believe that's what they're trying to do during this election campaign. And I say that not because I think Mr. Sirisena is a puppet. I think he's a patriot. But when I read his program and I watch what's happening, it's very clear that he is going to hand over most of his power to the parliament and the cabinet, which will be dominated by the West's favorites, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe and Madam Chandrika Kumaratunga. So it's an attempt at an electoral coup.
Doctor, you spoke about leadership, independent-minded leadership, strong leadership. But isn't this leadership responsible for what's happening at the Ministry of External Affairs?
Well, yes, it is, Dushan, but, if you have an institution in which the chairman is a proven success, but he allows wrong things to happen or bad things to happen, then you have to decide whether you want to remove him as chairman or whether you want to remove those heads who are making those mistakes. Now, I think we have an important decision to make. There's a phrase, biblical phrase, sins of commission and sins of omission. That's the things that you do wrong and the right things you don't do. I think that President Rajapaksa's sins are those of omission rather than commission. I've listened to all the criticisms of Mahinda Rajapaksa, and I'm aware more than anybody else of the errors in the foreign relations field. But I've also worked with Mahinda Rajapaksa in the international relations field, and I find him to be far more positive than negative. His positives greatly outweigh his negatives. So when I look at the presidential election, I'm very conscious of what the question is here. The question is, who should get the top job? Who should be the top executive? Who should lead the country? Who's the captain of our ship or our team? Are Mahinda Rajapaksa's credentials better or worse than the person who is challenging him? Is the challenger's credentials, are the credentials better than Mahinda Rajapaksa's? I would say clearly, Mahinda Rajapaksa is way ahead for the top job because of what he did. He did something that 4 presidents before him could not or did not do. That is, restore peace. Restore peace. Allow us to have a normal life so that we can even elect somebody else. But that's because of Mahinda. That nobody's dying at this presidential election campaign. I mean, Gamini Disanayak was killed by the tigers. Chandrika lost one eye. Premadas was killed during election campaigns or May days. Yeah. Now, Mahinda did something that 4 presidents had a better chance of doing, because by the time he inherited the problem, the LTT was huge. But they didn't do. That's point number 1, because the main duty of a leader of the country is to protect that country and its society, and he did that. The second thing is, after 30 years of war, rebuilding the country, and he has started that. He started it from the most important place, that is the infrastructure. In any country, after war, you start rebuilding with the infrastructure. Whether it was Germany after World War II or Japan, that's where you start. And he started that. He has not finished it. And there's a lot of problems. I mean, there's nepotism, corruption, all of that. But I think we can fix that in this way, not by trusting Mahinda Rajapaksa, but by re-electing him as the president, but electing the opposition at the parliamentary election. Because that way, you can remove those people who are responsible for the bottlenecks, for the corruption. You can have a new cabinet. You can have the national government that Mr. Sirisena is talking about. You can make Mr. Sirisena the prime minister or the leader of the opposition. That's our choice. I don't see any reason why Mahinda Rajapaksa should be removed from this post, and for us to deprive ourselves of a strong and successful leader. I mean, if you take East Asia, leaders like Mahinda, Mahathir Mohamad, I interviewed him for Rupavahini when he came years ago. Lee Kuan Yew. Not only did they stay in office, they were repeatedly re-elected by the people in order to keep them there and to get work done out of these guys. And I think we should do the same with Mahinda Rajapaksa. But that doesn't mean that we should put up with all the stuff that we are putting up with. Let's throw the rascals out at the parliamentary election. We have a chance.
Right, with me on Hot Seat today on Sri Lanka Live is Sri Lanka's former permanent representative and ambassador to the UN in Geneva and former Sri Lanka's ambassador in France and to the UNESCO, Dr. Dayan Jayatilleke. Welcome back to Hot Seat on Sri Lanka Live. With me is Dr. Dayan Jayatilleke. Dr. Jayatilleke, is Mahinda Rajapaksa a dictator?
Well, Dushan, every time I hear that, I can't help but burst out laughing. I mean, the same people who say he's a dictator say that he's going to be defeated on January 8th. You can't defeat a dictator through a peaceful democratic election just like that. It never happens in world history. Either you need a revolution or a peaceful uprising of the people or an invasion by a foreign power. The very fact that we don't know who's going to win this election means that Mahinda Rajapaksa is not a dictator.
But how about the sacking of the Chief Justice and the corruption that is taking place?
Yeah, those are bad decisions, those are wrong decisions. It doesn't mean that the man is a dictator.
And going for another third term?
Yeah, well, the third term...
it is not constitutional, what the opposition says.
Well, that's what the opposition says. But Algeria changed its constitution so that the president could have a third term. Bolivia, Evo Morales, who was re-elected this time, was for the third term with a constitutional amendment. Nicaragua had a constitutional amendment in order to remove term limits. Venezuela had the removal of term limits. So I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's been done in other countries. And these are not dictatorships. It gives you the chance, if you want to re-elect this person for a third term. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa can run for a third term, but we can also throw him out. I mean, we don't know whether we are going to. We have made our mind up. So that's not a dictatorship. When Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, she was in her fourth term, where there was a rebellion against her within her cabinet. Yeah. So that's not the problem. There's another problem. The problem is that part of the 17th Amendment that part of the 18th Amendment that killed off the 17th Amendment about independent commissions. But of course, for a long time before the 17th Amendment, we didn't have independent commissions. That was a bad thing. But it was Mrs. Bananak in 1972 who abolished the Independent Public Services Commission.
But then, Doctor, how about family?
Her daughter didn't bring it back. Jaya Jawaharlal didn't bring back the Independent Commission. I was very glad that Kharuja Surya did move the 17th Amendment. And it was wrong of the President to move the 18th Amendment and remove the 17th Amendment. Yeah. But we can bring back the 17th Amendment. the same way it was brought in the first place, and the same way in which Mahinda Rajapaksa brought the 18th Amendment, which killed off the 17th Amendment, in Parliament. We can do that after the parliamentary election if there's a majority. That can be one of the issues on which the opposition runs for the parliamentary elections, that we are going to bring back the 17th Amendment. Everyone will vote for them.
How about, Doctor, that the family bandism that is creeping up now?
Oh, there's plenty of that. But again, we saw it under Madam Sirimao Bandanayake. That was not a presidential system, it was a parliamentary system. We saw it under D.S. Senanayake, which is why S.W.R.D. Bandanayake left the United National Party, because he thought the Senanayakas were going to dominate the place. Mrs. Bandanayake allowed the Ratwatas, Bandanayakas, Obesekaras to run the place. I mean, Anura, Chandrika, Surendra were running riot at that time. And what about Chandrika's presidency? You had Anuruddha Ratwate, her uncle, as the Deputy Minister of Defense. The mother, Sirimao Bandanayake, was the Prime Minister. Chandrika was President. And Anura was something or the other, either the Speaker or the Foreign Minister or something. I mean, that's family bandism. And the Rajapaksas are doing the same thing, maybe worse. So, we can fix that. That's very easy, like I said.
You mean to say that that's okay to continue the same pattern?
No, it's not okay, but you fix it at the parliamentary election. How did we get rid of family bandism under Mrs. Bandanayake? We voted them out. If the pendulum swings the other way at the parliamentary election, who is going to make the other members of these members of the family ministers? Nobody. I mean, we had that situation in 2001. We had Chandrika as president. We had the UNP running the cabinet in 2001 after Chandrika was re-elected in 1999. The United States has a Republican Congress and a Democratic White House. We can do the same. I'm saying Mahinda Rajapaksa is one member of the Rajapaksa family who we have to keep for our interests, because he's better than the competitors. Right now, what I see is that Mr. Maithripala Sirisena, whom I've had a long discussion with at his invitation, just as I've had a long discussion with President Rajapaksa recently at his invitation, he is a very fine man. I hope someday he will become the executive president of Sri Lanka, but that's not what he's running for now. He is running to abolish the executive presidency, which I think is the worst single thing anybody can do to this country.
You mean to say that, this executive presidency is the way forward to Sri Lanka?
Oh, absolutely, Dushan. I mean, look at the UN Security Council. The 5 most successful countries in the world: the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France. Of the 5, 4 have executive presidencies. Only the British don't. So we want to imitate the British and not the other 4. We look at the BRICS, the emerging world powers. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Only India has a parliamentary system. All the others have executive presidencies. So what? We want to throw that out and bring back the parliamentary system? Dushan, at this moment, we have seen what these parliamentarians are like. They are jumping from one side to the other every day. Are these the guys you want to give executive power to, as Mr. Sirisena's manifesto promises to do? These guys, you want to trust them with our destiny? Or do we trust whoever it is, who we elect by a majority of the votes of this country taken as a whole? 50.1% elect the president, whoever the president is. Do we trust our leaders, who we elect, all of us together with a majority? Or do we trust these parliamentarians who are playing a game of musical chairs? I don't trust the parliamentarians more than I trust any president who we have elected as a majority, as taken as a whole. I mean, it's completely wrong. This is why President Jayawardena advocated, even when he was a minister in the Senanayaka's cabinet, advocated the executive presidency. He said in his address in 1966 to the Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Sciences, he had studied the world and he said, a third world country for economic development, you need, and I quote, a strong and stable executive free from the whims and fancies of the legislature, unquote. Because you can't allow this volatile legislature to be in charge of the destinies of the country. It's much better to elect one person and for that person to lead. What are executive powers? The powers of decision making. That's where the buck stops. That's the captain of the ship or the team. Now, do we want to take the power from that leadership and give it to these guys who are running around, jumping from one side to another like a classroom during interval? I don't think so.
Doctor, you spoke about this inquiry, the panel appointed by the UN, the Human Rights Council, to inquire into the human rights allegations in Sri Lanka. But in Sri Lanka, we have a quite a comprehensive document, the LLRC recommendations, if you are to do something with regards to the human rights allegations. Why not the government is doing this?
Well, the government should, but I'm also shocked by what the opposition is saying. The opposition doesn't have one word of criticism of the UN panel of inquiry. Instead, it promises to hold an independent domestic inquiry. Now, that is not even in the manifesto. It is in a 4-page document that was distributed to the press on the same day that the manifesto was distributed, but it's not in the manifesto. I first saw it in an Associated Press report, and then an AFP report, and then in the Indian papers. Why? That sounds very strange to me. Now, why didn't they say, while we oppose the UN panel of inquiry into Sri Lanka, we shall implement the LLRC recommendations for an independent inquiry into specific incidents. The LLRC has listed 7 or 8 incidents.
You mean to say the opposition?
Yeah, but they're not doing that. Instead, they're saying we shall have an independent domestic inquiry. Dushan, there are countries which have had independent domestic inquiries into war crimes. Those were about military coups. You know, Brazil, many of these countries where the military had taken over and had run dictatorships. Never about a situation in which the legitimate army reunified a country by defeating terrorism. And even in the case of dictatorships, Dushan, it took 40 years, Bangladesh 40 years to start an investigation into what happened in 1971. In some countries like Spain, where I served as ambassador while I was serving in France, the horrendous civil war, which ended 75 years ago, cannot be investigated. There's a ban, a legal ban on it. And a judge who tried had a case against him. That is because some countries realize that you mustn't reopen these wounds. And the ones that do reopen the wounds wait until there's a new generation. It is very wrong of the opposition to step outside the framework of the LLRC, make no reference to the LLRC, make no criticism of the UN war crimes inquiry, and then to promise a domestic investigation. I wonder whether it is to frame Mahinda Rajapaksa in case he loses the election.
No, my concern is, Doctor, it's not about the opposition, but why not the government is doing this, the implementation? No?
Well, the problem is that there is too much dominance of the Ministry of Defense over policy. And that is why I want to change the parliamentary election, to push these reforms.
But President is the Minister of Defense.
Yeah, the President is the Minister of Defense. But if you remember, when the UNP was wielded the power in the cabinet in 2001, the Deputy Minister of Defense was appointed by the new government. So you can have a new Deputy Minister of Defense. Now you don't have one. And if there is a Deputy Minister of Defense and a Foreign Minister and a number of ministers who are reform-minded, then all of this can be pushed through. But you must not break the framework of the executive presidential system, which is what the opposition has promised to do in 100 days. What happens to the Northern Provincial Council the moment you break the executive presidential framework? The Northern Provincial Council remains within the confines of the unitary state because there is an executive presidency which exercises power through the governors. What happens when you break the executive presidency in 100 days? How can the parliament control that? They'll go to the courts. Under what law are you retaining them? What if they pass a resolution calling for the withdrawal of the armed forces from the north? What if they pass a resolution calling not for ELM but for a referendum? Without the executive presidency, how is this going to be contained? This is absolutely irresponsible, and as a political scientist, I'm totally opposed to it.
Dr. Jayatilleke, finally would like to know, how will the result of the presidential election, which will take place on the 8th of Jan, affect the Human Rights Constitutions in March?
Well, if President Rajapaksa is replaced by Mr. Sirisena, and Mr. Sirisena implements his promise to abolish the executive presidency in 100 days and hand power over to Parliament and the Cabinet, which means that Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe and Madam Chandrika Kumaratunga will have more power than Mr. Maithripala Sirisena in 100 days. I dread to think of what will happen in Geneva, because I think there'll be a sellout by Sri Lanka, because given the track record of Ranil and Chandrika, I won't be surprised if they agree to comply with everything that the UN says in Geneva.
If Mahinda Rajapaksa remains?
Well, if Mahinda Rajapaksa wins and he doesn't make any changes in his representation in Geneva and in his foreign ministry, then he will be in serious trouble. But we will be in far more serious trouble if the opposition wins, because after all, Dushan, look at our television screens, what happened with Cuba. Finally, the United States had to climb down because the Cubans held firm and they maintained their dignity. It's a country which is poorer than Sri Lanka and a far smaller population. So, I'm not saying we should do the same thing, but it's better to face it in a principled way, and during my time I have shown how we can win there, than to just do what Ranil did when he was Prime Minister, the CFA, or what Chandrika did bringing in Eric Solheim. I don't trust these people. I trust Maithripala. But I believe what Maithripala says, that he's going to transfer executive powers in 100 days and go home. He says that. That's what worries me. Because I certainly prefer Mahinda Rajapaksa, even with his family. I mean, Gotabaya, at least the guy has done a lot for Colombo. I prefer Mahinda and Gotabaya, though I don't like family bandism or family rule. I prefer them to the failed Ranil and Chandrika as our leaders.
So you also have the plans of joining the foreign mission again?
No, nobody's invited me and I haven't been asked to do that. Probably they won't. I mean, I know these guys. I am arguing that we should support Mahinda Rajapaksa, knowing full well the way they behave. That's why I have said you can't stop there. At the parliament, we must re-elect Mahinda Rajapaksa, but we must also think seriously of electing a new government at the parliamentary election.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dayan Jayatilleke, the Sri Lanka's former ambassador and the permanent representative of the UN in Geneva, as well as Sri Lanka's former ambassador in France and at the UNESCO. So thank you very much once more, and keep watching Hot Seat on Sri Lanka Live.